Reverend Chantilly Mers-Pickett, who is our music minister at Central Christian Church. She is a longtime friend of mine. She's played an important role in my journey to where I am as pastor of Central Christian. And it's an honor to have her here to talk with her and to learn about her life and about her calling and about where she is headed towards. Chantilly, thanks for joining us today. Thanks for agreeing to do this. Could you give us an introduction to yourself and the way that you'd like to introduce yourself, and also tell us a little bit about your journey of faith, from how you were raised, your faith background, into where you are now?
Stephen, I'm glad to be on this. Glad to be on this conversation with you. I think "Wandering Conversations" is a great title because I think so much of faith is wandering. I want to first say that when I tell people about my journey of faith, I want to I encountered God when I was a child, but the way that I was taught religion and faith was very fundamental or very rigid. I was taught to memorize the Bible when I was quizzed on it, things like that. I went to church like 3 to 4 times a week. But I don't think faith really became my own until I was in high school. I had a good friend of mine we were both going through a very difficult time with our family. And I love telling the story of my first encounter with God because I'd always known about God and I had studied God as a child. Well, my first encounter was one of just sheer embrace and peace, actually. And so my friend and I dragged him to a Baptist church, and we were both going through a hard time, as I said. And I remember feeling so empty and feeling lost. My mom was attending my grandmother who was ill, who was on her deathbed. And it was during the holidays. I'll never forget that because I remember feeling quite lonely and quite sad about the holiday season. And my stepdad and I didn't have the greatest relationship. And so I was staying with my aunt, who I didn't know was also going through a very difficult time herself. So I felt really alone. And I know that that feeling is very common for teenagers. And it's common for us, I think, now, even in this time of isolation. But I know I was longing for something deeper and something, yeah, I was longing for peace. So my friend and I dragged him to this Baptist church. We sat at the back of the pew. And I just recall like the sound of the piano, and music always has a calming effect on me. It always brings me to center. But I still remember this piano was going, and this preacher simply said, "Whatever it is you're going through, there's nothing that you have felt that Jesus himself has not felt. And Jesus knows what you're going through." And at that moment, it felt like as a teenager, it felt like, whoa, someone saw me and someone knew what I was going through. And he said, "And if you want to know that, why don't you just step on up and walk on up?" This was the first altar call had ever experienced. I've experienced revivals and things like that, but I've never sort of, done an altar call.
Mm-hmm.
And so I stepped forward, and he looked at me, and with one look, he said, "Oh, daughter, child, there's so much that you have. There's so much that you're carrying." And I straight like to this minister just like broke down. And I mean, it seems sort of melodramatic when I talk about it now, but it really, when you're a teenager and you just want to be seen, you want to be known, and you want someone to acknowledge what you're going through. I knew in that moment, like I had experienced this embrace. I felt in my body and in my spirit, like completely accepted.
Mm-hmm.
And um, yeah, and I knew then that like this was going to be my journey. And so when I think about the way I introduce myself or the way I think about myself in the world, I feel like I was someone who encountered God. And I say that I was a worshiper before I was, quote unquote, a believer, because I knew what it meant to surrender. And I knew what it felt like to surrender. And since that moment, I feel like I've just been on that journey of trying to figure out and wander my way through what does it mean to surrender to this presence and to God and to Jesus and to the community of faith. But it's just this constant thing. I'm a worshiper before I'm a believer. I'm a I'm a lover of God before I am a thinker or a leader, say.
Mhm. Mhm.
And so I don't know if I told you that, but I went on a search. I went to, I had some friends who were Mormon, so I went with them to their Mormon churches, and they used to do these Mormon dances. We used to have these dances as a young person. I went to my aunt's Baha'i faith for a while,
Mhm.
and I went into a temple. I went into there's a bunch of different temples in Hawaii where I grew up. I remember going to temples and just sitting there and just looking at things and just trying to sense the presence again.
Mhm.
Like, where's this presence?
Mhm.
And so I wandered a little bit. I want to say for a year, I wandered a little bit until I was about, I want to say like 16 going on 17, and I walked into an Assemblies of God church. Did I
Mhm.
tell you this? I was AOG for about a year.
No, no, I didn't.
Oh, this is my charismatic. So I walked in and people were in this ecstatic praise. And I said, whoa, something's really going on here. So I spent a year there. I didn't develop the gift of speaking in tongues. And so I asked the pastor why I don't have the gift of tongues. And they said,
Mhm.
you'll get it. And I was like, I know, but I just don't have it. Um, anyway, I started asking really critical questions around that time, and I felt like I wasn't getting a lot of good answers. And then someone invited me to sing at another church. They said, "Hey, we heard that you're." I was in a reggae band. Okay, all the random songs. I was in a reggae band. They heard that I was singing. They're like, "Hey, we heard that you're going to this one church. We need some singers at this other church. You want to see?"
Mhm.
Okay, and then I found myself at this more evangelical church, which was definitely not charismatic the way AOG was, but I felt a very peace in the way that they sang devotional Christian music.
Mhm.
Anyway, sang some music with them, and the sort of story goes of how I got involved in worship was literally someone inviting me to sing a song, my first song up on a stage.
Mhm.
And it was not a quote unquote secular song, it was a song about coming as we are.
Mhm.
And they said, "Hey, I really think this is a beautiful song for your voice. You want to sing it?" Got me up on there. I started singing these words, Stephen, and the presence came again. I was just tender. I was like,
And
and that's how I got started singing worship was
up
really
to that
because
point, you had only sung
I'd
in
only,
reggae band.
I had only sung as a performer, as an entertainer, so to speak, until someone asked me to sing this song for this church for a special thing. And
Mhm.
then it kind of, that's what sort of switched in me. And I said, oh, I could actually sing, I could channel this
Mm.
through music. And
Right.
that's how I would say that's what really launched my own seeking and surrender, but like expression of faith
Mhm.
was through worship. So it started with me singing there, and then a bunch of the local sisters
Uh-huh.
approached me and said, "Hey, we heard that you've also danced hula," and
Mm.
I said, "Yes." And they're like, "Well, have you considered dancing hula here with us?" And I was like, "No." Uh, and they got me into dancing with them. So a lot of my faith, when I say that I could committed to a faith community at that point for the last 2 years, I think of high school,
Mhm.
I was dancing hula and I was singing in the worship teams and the worship bands. And it's in those 2 years that I grew the most as a singer, which then led me to start worship leading.
Right.
So it's all happening sort of in high school as I then I left for college. But
You mentioned that you grew up more fundamentalist, but your first experience was experiential
yeah,
without, and then you went off and did your own seeking. So
yeah.
it's almost like the nut of the faith grew out of a personal experience.
Oh,
Um, and then also you mentioned music, and I had this for later, but now it's probably a good time to talk about it. You mentioned that you sat in the Baptist church and you heard the piano, and that's kind of what kind of
mhm,
set you up for your
mhm.
experiential moment. What is it about music that hits you, that touches your spirit? And what do you think it is about music in worship that is so impactful and so important? I mean, it splits churches. It's like it's a huge thing in the history of the church is music. So, what is it about music that that is so striking for people in the worship experience?
Well, for me, when I hear music or when I'm leading music, I cannot help but feel like if you've only if people have only seen me or experienced me leading music, I think one might assume that I go about the world with my heart open like that. But the truth is, that is not how I am wired. I am not one to experience a situation through my feelings. And every personality thing I've ever taken says that I experience things through my mind first, and then eventually it gets down to my heart. So, my first inclination when you ask me this question is to say music helps me to feel, and it helps me to access my heart in ways that I don't access it normally. And I think that's what made faith so revolutionary for me as a young person, because I was such a doer and I was such a perfectionist, and I deep down inside I think I was always striving for worthiness. I was always striving to be good, to be accepted by by your parents, your teachers, your but in reality I couldn't. I think this is an ongoing life struggle of me, is to embrace myself as I am, and that requires a little hard work and a little vulnerability. um, and so it's interesting because I think when I tell people that, they're like, no, but that's not how I experience you. And I said, I know, because if you experience me in worship or in music, it's because I come up there and it's like there's nothing I can do but open my heart. And I know the times, and Stephen, you know the times when I lead music when my heart isn't open. Like you feel it. Like it's like, oh, Chantilly was just going through the motions of that one, you know? But man, when I open my heart, when I'm able to access the feeling and I'm able to access that connection with the divine, which is oftentimes these days just sheer gratitude. I'm like looking out my window right now and I look at the trees and I'm like, you've been on this earth for so long. Worship. Creation is constantly worshiping, giving adoration to God. Music is that portal for me, it's that channel for me. Even when I'm listening to music, sometimes when I'm doing things, I can't listen to music. I say you have to turn that off, because I literally sometimes will stop. Like I'm suspended. Now I have to feel this song. Now I have to cry about this song. Now I have to think about this song. So music does that for me. And I think in a community, I don't know, you know it, Stephen. I feel like I'm just telling you things you already know. Maybe you are people who already know this, but you know what it's like when you're in a space and the music changes the atmosphere and you feel utterly connected to one another and to God. And, you know, I live for those things and I live for those moments, like when people open their hearts together.
You began with this impactful musical experience and worshiping, being a worship leader. Eventually, you went from Hawaii to Pepperdine to Union, kind of doing, making your way using music as one of your talents and gifts to the church. So, can you talk a little bit about where you see your calling, where you see, obviously you're gifted and you're talented, but where do you see your calling? You're an ordained pastor, you're an ordained minister, and we talk about calling a lot. So how do you see your calling, and maybe how it's changed?
Yeah. So I love that we are centering it on music and surrender. And because part of music, I think, is a channel or a portal, I call it sometimes. And I think I am, how do I say this without overthinking it? I really live to create spaces where people encounter God's presence. And music is one of the ways that I do that. It's one of the ways that I create and help create and channel our hearts to God's heart. And I've always seen myself as a worship leader as really almost someone who just can open up the gate just a little bit so that people can just feel that presence and be touched in their spirits. And over time, so I've literally, since I sang in that church when I was a high school student, I've been leading music and leading worship, and it's a part of who I am. And over the I don't know, I want to say like the last decade or so, I've also been facilitating meaningful conversations. And I find that whether I'm leading music or facilitating a meaningful conversation, it's taken me years to say that, wow, I'm really called to create sacred spaces
Mm-hmm.
that transform people transform the way they see themselves, that transform the way they relate to one another and the way they relate to the divine.
Mm-hmm.
And while it's started in worship spaces, and while it started in liturgy, and it starts in choosing songs that support the sermon and choosing language that communicate this expansive and wide love of God, I realized that I want to create spaces that people can do that in conversations, and people can experience the same power and the same transformative um, wind of the spirit in conversations and work that we do together. So everyday work, meetings, retreats, and that even extends to the way we gather at tables, like the communion table. That's a really another huge passion of mine, is thinking about communion, and we'll get to there hopefully. But I really feel like my calling, and I knew this even when I got ordained, Stephen. When you even said, "Hey, you should check out the disciples," I was like, I don't want to be a pastor of word and sacrament. Like that's not my call. I just knew that that's not what I was meant to do. Preaching every Sunday is not what I was meant to do. Um,
I don't know if anyone's
and
meant. I'm just.
it's a labor of love, Stephen. Um, but I knew in my heart that I am a leader, and I knew I needed to carve that space out. And I knew that it was going to be a different kind of space in the church. And only now, I mean, I got ordained 5 years ago now. I feel like 5 years in of taking my vows to the church, I feel like I'm finally getting a glimpse of the kind of spaces and the kind of community and the kind of work I want to see myself doing in the future. And it is really a merging of music, of creativity, of shared meals, like breaking bread together, celebration and joy, all the components that you think of in a worship service,
Mhm.
but in a very sort of where the word is usually preached by the pastor. In my work of facilitation, I've come to believe that the word, God's, the proclamation of good news can actually come also from the people. And that sort of has been my shift over the years of how can the people, in their words, in their stories, in their way of life, proclaim the good news as a community. And that's kind of where I am now. Like, how do I create sacred spaces for the good news to be proclaimed by everyday people in the way that they live their lives and the way they imagine the future and the way they break bread together?
Mhm. It's very disciples. If you think
Oh,
about
right?
our history and the way that we grew up, the idea that the Stone Campbell movement was one of a lay-led movement, and they reject the idea of bishops. They reject the idea of, I mean, even technically, the clergy is not supposed to be at the table. Technically, the communion is supposed to be served by the lay leaders. So
Yes.
it's a
Oh.
very disciples.
And remember when I got ordained, literally the Spirit told me, because the laying on of hands, they called all of the ministers to do the laying on of hands.
Mhm.
And I said, wait a second, it's not just the ordained clergy that are the mediators of God's grace and presence, it's the people. And I
Mhm.
literally said, I looked at Pastor Jackson, I said, can we call everybody up? He's like, wait, what? What? I said, yes, call everybody up. Everybody to lay on of hands.
Mhm.
And it, like, to me, that's literally the embodiment. Like when I heard that disciples practice this form of communion, I'm telling you, I had just written, just a couple years prior to, I had just written my thesis on communion
Mhm.
being a communal act of solidarity
Mhm.
with one another, with the least among us,
Mhm.
an active practice of us rejecting the powers of empire
Right.
and when they said, oh, we do communion every week, and it's the lay people that lead it because it's really belongs to the table, belongs to everybody, belongs, and I was like, sign me up.
Yeah, it's very radical.
And
Communion is so radical, and I think we lose that, and we've lost an element of that through the liturgy or through just even I think practicing it every week. Well, I've learned to love it. I didn't grow up that way, but
right.
I think it becomes just a routine part of service, and we lose the radicality of what communion is.
Yes, yes. And so you know, when I think about what I feel like the spirit has put in me to grow, literally, I feel like I'm growing something in my spirit, like like a child, like a um I feel like it's literally that. It's when we centered our worship services on the word, right? The word, right? Everything culminates in the word, and then we have communion. It's our response to the word proclaimed. It's our response to God's grace. Like, how much pressure do we put on our pastors
Mm-hmm.
to come with us every week with the word? How much pressure? Pastors are reading things, trying to get at not only managing churches, managing buildings, managing personalities, and then you got to come every week with a word, and I'm supposed to receive that word, you know? And
Mm-hmm.
I think there's a some extent, and I wrote about this in my thesis, and I also wrote about it about worship, is that I think to some extent we in the church have created a bit more passive, or which should I say, you know, communities who come to receive and who are come to be nourished. And I think we should always keep nourishing our people. I think, you know, I'm not saying against that. I also think that to my theology has so shifted where it's like I don't know where I'm in the space of God, and the spirit is literally speaking messages everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
I get God's message through my children. I get God's message through this plant that I've been loving in my attic here. I'm telling you. When I say messages, I'm saying like God is speaking to us and revealing God's self everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And what disservice do we, when we train church folk to only come on a Sunday for that 15, 20-minute word to see where God's speaking to us? And I said, no, 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 God is speaking to you all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And how do we cultivate that spirituality and that practice of listening and being attentive to the spirit?
Mm-hmm.
Um, and so music is one way. Conversations is how human beings have always throughout history learned, grown, challenged each other, kept each other accountable.
Mm-hmm.
It's this, what we're doing right now. I mean, I know it's virtually, but you know what I mean.
Right.
But that's kind of what I'm wanting to put out into the world, and to start creating practices, like literally gatherings that help us practice us being attentive to
Mm-hmm.
the stories that God has, that we've lived, to the noticings that we have of the world, and finding God in there, and then talking to each other about it and finding out that, wow, there's even more wisdom when we're together. And there's more of God's guidance and good news when we're together. So we'll see how it goes. You know, I'm trying some new things, but I also know that by taking on some new things, I'm also having to release some things.
Right. So that's a good segue. So you've been at Central for a year and a half, officially as the minister of music. You played the, throughout my time there, the past 5 years. I guess January 3rd was my 5 year anniversary at the church. Um,
Oh,
and now you're going to be stepping away. You're going to be moving on to a new journey. So, what is it that you are beginning, and what is it? Can you explain it and kind of let us know what your hopes are for it, and just tell us a little bit about this new journey that you're going to be embarking on.
all right. So I'm excited to share that yes, I will be stepping. That there is some sadness in me stepping away as your music minister central. Um, but I also want to say that it's come at a time in my life through this pandemic and through me really trying to focus in on what I'm called to contribute to the world and to God's church is this. growing, what I was mentioning, this growing vision of creating gatherings and spaces where folks can practice sensing God's presence and wisdom among one another.
Mhm.
And that's come through what I'm calling the it's right now in its beginning stages, but it's called the Kingdom Collective. And I am working on a partnership, an ecumenical partnership between the Christian Church Disciples of Christ and the PCUSA, um, working on perhaps doing a collaboration, an ecumenical collaboration on trying a new virtual and in-person community, but it's going to begin mostly virtual,
Mhm.
where we're bringing people together to practice some indigenous and ancient ways of being together, which is around storytelling, which is around meaningful conversations, creativity, creating art and music. And I'm calling it like a dinner party. I think that some of the best teachings that Jesus has in our sacred texts has come when he's attending a party.
Mhm.
And he is hanging out, he's eating, there are drinks flowing, right? And something happens, and then a teaching comes, and we've captured it in our texts. And what I find in facilitation work, in my work of I'm with group of a global practitioners called Art of Hosting, is that sometimes our best conversations and our best ideas come when we're relaxed at a table.
Mhm.
And so what I'm trying to figure out is merge some of these practices, so some of the methodologies that I've learned as a facilitator, and incorporate them into sort of sacred spaces where folks can bring stories, folks can bring their questions. This is a conversational space. And there's also music, and there's food, and there's beverages flowing, and people are relaxed and connected.
Mhm.
And so I'm trying to merge. When I think about it, three things. It's communion, which is the breaking of bread and eating together. I'm trying to mix in a little bit of like those feeling of a retreat,
Mhm.
where you go to a retreat and somehow you know that this is a place to engage differently with the world and with each other.
Mhm.
And then mixed with a little bit of joy and celebration and a little bit of a dinner party feel where people are also enjoying each other. Um, and so that's what it is right now. I'm developing it. I'm trying to work on this collaboration between the two denominations, and also get funding hopefully for it. But I'm in a place where I know I need to step back on some things so that I could really deepen this work.
Mhm.
In, I want to think of the Kingdom Collective as a place to practice cultivating wisdom from our stories.
Mhm.
And so I'm going to start with just creating spaces for storytelling. And
Mhm.
it's going to start virtually. This is how it's going to have to be for a while. And then I hope that when things get safer and things open up, I can start adding elements to it. So if we can practice going into spaces, practicing listening deeply, practicing, right, which is bearing witness to one another,
Mhm.
the practice of speaking with utmost intention and speaking from our true place. We can cultivate those practices when we come in person. We get to add the elements of food. We get to add the elements, hopefully, of music, of hopefully coming onto a farm or a big backyard.
Mhm.
And people will already have the practice.
Right.
They will know what it means to transition into story. They'll know, so the way I'm imagining it right now is, how do I just start creating spaces virtually for practice,
Mhm.
so that when the time comes for us to be in person, it could be a 1 day thing or it could be a 3 day thing.
Mhm.
I want to the way that I'm choosing to work right now is through this principle called emergence, where Adrienne Marie Brown talks about it, where it's literally fractals. You practice small things and you practice it until it can grow, and till the practice becomes a pattern, until the pattern then becomes structures that we build around patterns. And so that's kind of how I'm imagining the Kingdom Collective. It's just that small practices of coming together to
Mhm.
speak authentically, to speak our true stories. And then when we come in person, we can plan. There's so many things that we can do when we come in person, that I would love. I can't wait to do. And I also want to say that I don't imagine the Kingdom Collective replacing Sunday worship.
Okay.
Okay.
Not
Okay.
starting a house church.
And the reason why is because I think there's still a place for our spirituality to come and to hear the word proclaimed and
Hmm.
to take communion. I don't ever want to replace that. I
Hmm.
actually feel like I want to enhance the experience of the word being proclaimed and experience in a community and not replace, because I do believe there is a powerful and important place for the preacher who is trained to come with a word and for me to receive it, because I still want to receive a word, you
Hmm.
know?
Right.
So for me, it's a practicing community, and that could take a lot of forms. And because of the pandemic, I think community is so expansive to me now.
It's funny because my experience of Bible study and small groups is that when we sit down intentionally and have our conversations, it's whatever it is, it's kind of dry, trying to get through it. But then at the party after the small group, when you move to the kitchen and you start having
Right.
snacks, that's when the Bible study really begins.
Yeah.
You have your
Yeah.
conversations, and
And you
people that
wonder,
are,
right? Like,
people that are afraid to talk,
exactly.
they're actually starting to talk.
Right. So for me, it's like, what if we just, I think people long to connect. I really do think that they long to connect to one another. I sometimes think that we have to, as hosts, right? This is why I consider myself, when you ask me, like, what's your calling now? It's like, I'm a spiritual host. I'm a host. Is that all I do is help create better conditions for people to connect to one another and to God and to the longings that are in them. I think sometimes we're held in these kind of archaic ways of coming together,
Hmm.
and the more organic ways are where you see life and where you see energy and where you see creativity, right? Like you said, it's like, oh, it's after we close our books and then we're hanging out.
Hmm.
Do we start, and I said yes. And that is learning for us. What if we were to create spaces that are more like that? But the point of it is we're leaving with wisdom, and we're leaving with a deeper sense of belonging to one another and belonging to the land. And that to me is like the goal. That's the goal.
Thank you for sharing that, and thank you for, me personally, thank you for the help that um, the way that you've helped me in being a pastor and even preparing on this journey. Thanks for all that different ways that you've supported me and supported Central, and you've offered your gifts to Central for quite a while now. And I know we're better off for it. And um, even just the ways that we can just meet on a regular basis and have these conversations offline has been very life-giving, especially during this pandemic, this time of separation. So I want to thank you, and I want to thank, on behalf of the church, thank you for your service and your ministry at Central, and we look forward to continuing in maybe a different form, but um, continuing nonetheless. So thank you, and thanks for spending this time with us.
It was my pleasure, Stephen. I want to say something. I
Mhm.
want to pause.
Go ahead.
I want to say something to Central Christian Church. It's been, this pandemic has been something interesting, right?
Mhm.
And I want to just encourage you all to keep going, to keep coming together. Pastor Stephen, you are not only a good friend, but you're an awesome, awesome leader. And and I know that you've been growing through this pandemic and you've turned pastor to producer, but Central, I hope that you can show some, like, just honor. I just want to honor you, Pastor Stephen, just for the ways in which you have called people together to create a new vision and mission, and imagine pushing Central into another place, that's a thriving and loving place. And so I want to honor you, and I want to thank you, Central, for just coming along, singing along, being together. I hope that more music will come and more folks will come together in community. But let's honor our pastor when you can. And if you watch this, I honor you, Stephen. I thank you for your friendship and for your leadership. I mean that, man. Like,